Thanks for your love and your welcome all day today. I've so enjoyed my time with you guys, and I'm so thrilled about what we are doing together today and this week of the tour I've been on for Compassion. This is the last day of my tour with Compassion, and I think we've had 250 plus kids we're hoping will have had sponsored across this week, at least that we're aware of by now, and hopefully more in the coming weeks and months as some of those relationships that have been new connections for Compassion this week come online with sponsoring kids, because that's what it's all about. So thank you those that you have, and please go to the table tonight and speak to Compassion about sponsoring a child. I have some resources with me too, so please speak to Hannah at the table out there about stuff that I brought with me to invest into your world. There is a digital download seminar that I want you to think about investing in for you or someone else, or for your team or your company, your organization. It is called Prosperity of the Soul. The Prosperity of the Soul is a new seminar I've just started doing around the world, but I've recorded it all to camera with a download Q&A workbook for you and your teams. It's about a 3-hour event, a 3-hour seminar that I recorded live in Indonesia a couple of months ago, where we had over 1,000 people come to the seminar. And I'm doing it because I think most humans do not understand that part of their humanity, and certainly most Christians don't. We've concreted over the soul in the church, and we have an overdeveloped spirit while we have a languishing soul. And I pastored for 30 odd years, and so you know how I know those things. And so wanted to spend some time at this stage of my life speaking to humans about the need to be intentional about nurturing your soul, looking after your soul. It's no good taking your body to the gym and looking great in your body, but then you have toxicity and negativity in your soul. You won't get away with it. And that's why I did the Aging Well resource, by the way, which is also out there. Aging Well, as you can see, I am. I'm 95. Because I figured out at my age and stage of life, I should have figured some stuff out now about aging well. And aging well is never a default mode. You have to be intentional about aging well, especially after 40, when the free ride of youth is over. You've got to start paying then. And I did, a teaching, a video series on aging well in 5 areas. Aging well physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally, and generationally. Aging well across the range of your humanity is the key, I think. So think about that stuff out there. This green one's called Growing Big People, another passion of my life, to grow people and not things. Again, that's several hours of teaching on growing people more than we should be growing things. Then finally, live full, die empty. I think that's the commission God has for the church. I think we forget that. Our church did. I think we think the idea is to get full, stay full, and retain our fullness. But God is not drawn to full things. God is drawn to emptiness. And when churches stop finding empty people, empty spaces to fill and bring God's life to, I've watched this over a generation or two now, and church history. When churches stop finding empty people and empty places to fill, God loses interest in us. Because we are now comfortable with part of the 99. We pull the drawbridge up, like I said this morning, and we recirculate grace and love inside the castle. And we don't need a repeat of that in our church history. The monasteries did enough damage for that. When the church went into monasteries, retreated behind walls, it resulted in what was called the Dark Ages all across Europe, because the church was absent. There was no light coming from the church. Anyway, I'm back now. I went off on one then, but I'm back. I'm going to read to you from Exodus 5. It's a little longer reading as this than I like to normally read, but I think because I want you to see this idea I have for you tonight in its context. And this may not be a passage you've read for a while, so perhaps there's value in reading it for all those reasons too. It says, afterwards, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he must strike us with plagues or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." Then Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. You're no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Do not reduce the quota. They are lazy. That's why they're crying out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make their work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies. Then the slave drivers and overseers went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says, I will not give you any more straw. Go get your own straw, wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all. So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, complete the work required of you for each day, just as when you had straw. And Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers they had appointed, demanding, why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before? Then the Israelite overseers went and appealed to Pharaoh, why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told, make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. Pharaoh said, lazy. That's what you are, lazy. And this is why you keep saying, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks. The Israelite overseers, note this phrase, realized they were in trouble when they were told, you are not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day. When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said, may the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Wow. I think the first thing I want to say to you about this passage is that freedom is complicated. And I think it's important that we as God's people know that God understands that freedom is not straightforward at all. It never has been, it never will be. I think you need to know, those of you that tonight feel stuck or feel in need of freedom, or you're in the neighborhood of freedom, and we are in the church. Our gospel is a gospel of freedom. The lyrics of our songs, the language of our preaching and our praying and our conversations and our writing and our posting is all around the idea of freedom. But you may not feel free at all tonight. And you may feel, and I think we've been guilty of this in the church, I know our church was, of oversimplifying how complicated freedom is. But God understands, and humanity need to know this, that God understands that freedom is complicated. I think the unchurched need to know that we, the church, understand that freedom is complicated. I think this at least flags up that for us, because what's going on here, as you know, is that these Hebrew slaves had been in confinement and slavery and bondage for 430 years. It's about 18 generations is how long they had been under this generational successive forms of oppression. And God decides to intervene after all this time when God had been silent and absent. He decides to reintroduce himself to them and sends in Moses and Aaron to confront Pharaoh with this idea of letting everyone go, perhaps 2 million plus workforce. So it was never going to be a slam dunk at all that was going to happen, and God knew that. So God approaches this whole stuck nation that had been generationally stuck. And by the way, I have a theory, anything that is established to a third generation, by the way, good or bad, takes on a permanence it did not have in the first two. This is why I think God stopped introducing himself anymore after Jacob by anyone's names. He said, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and stopped naming names. There were other people after Jacob, but he didn't mention Moses or Joshua or Joseph. He stopped at Jacob. Because under Jacob, the solitary faith of Abraham and the solitary faith of Isaac took on nationhood. So in the third generation, the faith of Abraham took on this nationhood status, which it still has today. So if a thing gets to a third generation, and I've studied this over the years, it takes on a permanence in our societies, in our communities, in our own lives, that it didn't have in the first two when it was perhaps more fragile. I'm a first generation believer, and so I struggled to sustain my faith. I was the first and still am the only one of my kind in my family. And I had 5 brothers and sisters and mom and dad, and it was so difficult for me when I got saved at 15 to be a Christian in that environment. I couldn't read my Bible. I couldn't go to church without a problem. I couldn't have Christian music in the house. I couldn't have Christian friends. And some of you first-generation believers know how difficult that was for you. But if your kids grew up in a Christian home, they're second-generation believers, and so they had an easier time of it with regard to all of that. My kids grew up in a home where all of that wasn't a problem. But the problem the second-generation believers have is that they meet the church before they meet Jesus. And the church is far more difficult to love than Jesus is. Because the church is far more demanding, is far more judgmental, is far less loving and kind and gracious than Jesus is. So what happens is the second generation get to adolescence and teenage years and struggle to realize that they've given their lives to the church, but not actually to Jesus. They've had the faith of their parents that they've been hanging around and often have a crisis, as you know, in their teenage years. So my grandchildren, now I have 8 grandchildren, my grandchildren have been raised in the church. So I think the faith that I began in my family line, 40 plus, nearly 50 years ago, is now established in my grandkids' life. And I think through them it'll take on a nationhood, as it were. So imagine what 17 generations can do. 17 generations in slavery, bondage, containment, I would think is not just a physical, circumstantial issue. It is now in their physiology. It's in their biology. It is in their cellular makeup. If you spend any time, like apartheid South Africa, if you spend any time in a part of the world where there has been some regime, there has been a legalized oppression of other people, and speak to those people and be around these countries, it's amazing how it gets into the DNA of the emerging generation that were born into it, who know no different. That's been apartheid South Africa for about 3 generations now, since apartheid was established in the early 60s. And the humans that were born into that were born drowning, were born into that. So 17 generations is going on. So I'm telling you that to tell you that God knew that sending in Moses and Aaron to say to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," was never ever going to be really the problem. So God, knowing that they didn't know who he was, and knowing that perhaps they didn't feel safe with this God that they didn't know, he decides to re-enter their world with an elaborate calling card, which were the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues were theater. They were completely unnecessary as far as God was concerned. God didn't need the 10 plagues, but he knew that they needed to be reacquainted with him so that they knew that they'd be okay with this God that reintroduced himself. He was so powerful that he was able to dominate, at the word of Moses, the entire Egyptian war machine and government and power. So God knew that them leaving Egypt would not be as straightforward as you'd think it would be when a deliverer comes and says, "Let my people go." Because clearly what had happened is in their generations of slavery, they had formed an attachment to Pharaoh and to Egypt. I said, note the phrase, they realized they were in trouble when they heard that Pharaoh had decided to increase their hardship by saying, "You'll have the same quota of bricks, but you will not be helped to find straw." So he increased their hardship. And he says when they heard that, the Israelite foreman, when they heard that, they realized they were in trouble. It's a strange phrase in the narrative. How can you realize you're in trouble when you're already in trouble? These guys have been in trouble all their lives. They were born into trouble for generations. So how can someone in slavery realize they're in trouble? What it must be saying is that if you need more trouble to help you realize you are in trouble, it must mean you've made friends with the trouble that you're in. So the trouble you're in has become your new norm. And this is why freedom's complicated. Because people get attached to all kinds of miserable lives, but they somehow feel some sense of safety in that certainty of their own problems. And so they had settled into this attachment to their lives in Egypt, to the predictability, to the certainty, to the routine. And God knew that this had taken place for them, because God understands that we humans do that. And so Moses going in was never going to be easy. God knew the issue was never ever going to be, would Pharaoh let them go? The issue was always going to be, would they let Pharaoh go? And because God knew that they'd formed this attachment to Pharaoh, he has to increase their trouble to remind them that Pharaoh isn't your friend and Moses isn't your enemy. Because when they saw Moses, they said to Moses, you've made us obnoxious to Pharaoh. Hang on a minute, you already were. So you see how disoriented they are in their perception of who's their friend, who's their enemy. In modern language, this would be called a classic case of the Stockholm Syndrome. The Stockholm Syndrome didn't exist as a term until 1964 in Stockholm, Sweden, where a bank robbery went wrong and instantly became a hostage-taking situation. And the bank robbers took the bank staff hostage. It went on for several days. It was settled peacefully. No one got killed. No SWAT teams came in with the bullets flying because the bank robbers made sure that didn't happen. When it all went to trial, the bank robbers went to trial, and what shocked the Swedish justice system is none of the bank staff would give evidence against them. Because they felt the bank robbers looked after them so well while they were taken hostage. The bank robbers sent out for medications, sent messages to their loved ones to assure them no harm would come to them, made sure that they were taken care of, make sure they were fed and cared for, looked after them. So the hostages in the bank felt safer with their captors than they did with their liberators. Because as you know, and this has happened throughout history, the government and the politicians and the cops want to be seen to be resolving it the longer it goes on. And what the people in the bank knew is that because of the pressure to be seen to fix it, a SWAT team's going to come in, and bullets are going to fly, and a stray bullet's going to hit a bank staff member, and they are collateral damage, is what would have happened. And so they felt safer inside the bank, where the bank robbers assured them that it wouldn't come to that. They were committed to a peaceful outcome. There was no shootout planned. And so they negotiated their way out. But it meant that their prison sentences were hugely reduced because no one would give evidence against them. In fact, Jan Erik Olsen, the chief bank robber who masterminded the bank robbery, when he got released from jail after 10 years, he married one of the bank staff he took hostage. She fell in love with him. During the few days that she was taken hostage, she visited him in prison and formed a relationship with him, and the moment he got out, they got married. Now I tell you that and just let it sink a moment for how outlandish, how crazy, how unbelievable what I just said is, until I say to you, we have all done exactly the same thing. We have all in life, and some of you are doing it here tonight, that's why you're stuck. We have all gotten married to our own internal bank robbers. We have all formed an attachment to our own internal pharaohs. We have all formed a relationship with things in our life that have taken us hostage, that are denying us freedom, and we know that we have that in our lives, and we know that there's freedom potentially out there somewhere, but we feel safer in the bank, in the comfort, I suppose, like the Israelite slaves did. We feel safer with the Pharaoh we know than taking a chance with the Moses we don't know. So Moses may be the SWAT team guy, but they felt safer with Pharaoh than taking a chance on this guy that just rocks up and starts shouting, "Let my people go." And the moment he does that, Pharaoh says, "Okay, you're all going to suffer. You pay attention to these guys, I'm going to make your life miserable more than it is already," to get them to turn, which they did, against their own liberators, which they did. You made us obnoxious to Pharaoh. When I've spoken this message in various places in the world, I was in one place recently, and in the audience that day was a senior prison officer. And he came and said to me, he said, "You know, the reoffending rate is so huge, we don't know what to do about it." He said, "Just last week, we released a woman from prison who'd been in jail for 8 years for being involved in a robbery. He said the morning she got out of prison, she went to the mall, robbed a store, sat down on the sidewalk, waiting for the cops to come. Because she was so terrified of being free that she wanted to go back into prison because she felt safer in jail. She felt safer in the containment and the safety and predictability and no responsibility of being in jail than she did trying to get a job and pay rent and deal with bills and finances and people and all of that was so terrifying to her that she wanted to be in prison. That's why I'm saying to you tonight that you need to understand that freedom is complicated. And God knew that they were attached to Pharaoh, and he knows that some of us are too. And we get so attached to our problems, and we get so attached to the safety and the comfort, I suppose, of being inside our world with our hostage-taking wrong thinking, with our negativity and our fear and our judgmental attitudes and our emotional instability and our moodiness and our whatever it is that has become your normal operation in life, your default mode, whatever these belief systems or these ways of thinking and behaving are that have produced certain habits in life, it doesn't make you a bad person. You can be in here with your hands up in worship. You can glow in the dark when the anointing's on you. Don't make you a bad person. This is a human issue. It's not a Christian issue. It's a human issue where people get stuck and park up around the trouble they're in. And you can sit here and have someone say to you, have a preacher get up here and preach about freedom and setting you free, and you can shout amen, but you know you have no intention of going any further beyond that because you just feel so terrified at the idea of letting go of the Pharaoh and the bank robber that you have because your bank robber is treating you really well. You feel safe and your life's pretty predictable and you know that it's not great and you know it could be better, but you're a bit nervous about leaving it and stepping out and stepping up and getting rid of those relationships and applying for a better job and changing a lifestyle and coming away from the things where you've parked up for a long time. It is scary. And I know this especially because when I started reaching the poor, as I mentioned this morning in our church, I'm busing in hundreds of third, fourth generation unemployed. Third, fourth generation drug addicts and prostitution and crime and drug dealing and all kinds of stuff. When I started bringing these people in, I realized they felt so safe in their messed up, dysfunctional lives that it was one thing for me to get up and say, let my people go to the devil. But the truth was they didn't want to let go of their attachment to what clearly wasn't working. And they educated me to realize that I need to move away from simplistically declaring freedom and begin to spend more time sat down there than I do stood up here. To understand what that just sounded like to them. To understand how shallow and how not thought through and how one-dimensional and one-size-fits-all so much of our preaching was. To immerse myself, to baptize myself, which Jesus did for 30 years in anonymity. When we say we want to be like Jesus, we don't mean that bit. 30 years of total anonymity. I think in that time he was immersing himself into humanity so that when he comes on the scene, he has this massive connection with people that the religious people didn't have and were threatened by that he did have it and wondered where he got it from because he's just been this kid that's been a joiner, a carpenter in some backwoods called Nazareth, but he spent time listening, watching, immersing himself in the complications of what it was to be stuck and be unhappy and hate your life and hate your job and have a broken relationship and feel depressed and suicidal, which, by the way, is an all-time high in our Western world. Depression and suicide are all-time high. I hope you all know that. You need to know that, especially amongst young people. And it's gone out of control since the arrival of social media, has suicide amongst young people. Last year, our government, for the first time in our history, appointed a minister of suicide. That's how concerned our government are about those statistics. And those statistics, by the way, are only based on people who succeeded in killing themselves. There's no stats for those that attempted it. which I suggest is a far bigger constituency that's below the radar. So we live in a very troubled world, and that's why I think when we speak about freedom and we deal in that language and we preach and use that vocabulary, I think it has to be measured and weighted properly. And I think people don't trust us. People won't trust us if we're simplistic about the complications of their confinement, of their inner stuckness. And so God sends in Moses. So Moses is the liberator. These are the combinational punching ingredients you need to get you unstuck, to get you to leave your Pharaoh, to get you to leave your hostage takers internally. The combinational elements required are, you need a liberator, Moses, but you also need an agitator, Pharaoh. Because the only thing that creates movement in your life often when you're stuck is not a friend, but an enemy. The last thing some of you need is your friends telling you again this week how much they're praying for you and they're for you, because friends don't create movement. Enemies do. So God needs to use Pharaoh to be their enemy and dig his heels in, because Pharaoh was a pussycat. You've got to understand what's going on here. You don't get to be Pharaoh if you're an idiot. Pharaoh was a genius. He was in charge of the most powerful nation in the world. So Pharaoh's not an idiot. He's very smart. He's very powerful. He's surrounded by the best people in the world, in his government, in his military cabinet, he's got everything. He's got all the wealth of the world. He's like a god. And you would think, wouldn't you, because of the quality of Pharaoh as a leader, on, I don't know, maximum third plague, you'd think he would have thought, I don't know what this power is, just backing these people up, but whatever it is, I need to let them go because this is going to ruin our economy. Because he had frogs in his bathroom too. He had flies in his bathroom too. He had blood coming out of his taps too. So Pharaoh was not immune. Despite his power and wealth, he was not immune. So Pharaoh's suffering alongside the lowest of his people. So anybody worth their salt as a leader would have thought, whatever this is, we need to make terms of peace. We need to negotiate, because this power that's backing these guys, I've never seen anything like it in my life. But he didn't do that. And he didn't do it for one reason. God made him say no. The Bible says God hardened his heart. Everything about Pharaoh wanted to say go. But when he kept saying, he said no. And some of you don't understand what I just said. Some of you have no theology at all for God making you do stuff you don't want to do. Some of you don't know that God. I have had God in my life on 3 occasions make me do stuff I don't want to do. I have had a supernatural resolve for 3 years to take on the church mafia. You need resolve for that stuff because they're scary as hell. Some of you don't know what it is for God to put a constraint on you, like Jesus fixed his face like a flint, like Paul set in motion this plan to go to Rome where he knew he would die, and even prophecy about what would happen when he went there didn't bother Paul at all. He said, cool, that's cool, okay, I'm still going. When you're constrained, and Pharaoh is constrained, Pharaoh is under this divine constraint to say, no, you can't go, because he's part of the theater. Pharaoh's walk-on part was to keep saying no. So God made him play his part in the drama he didn't want to be part of. So Pharaoh's line is, no, you can't go. Moses' line is, let my people go, while God is working to loosen them from their attachment to Pharaoh. And so God has to create a bricks without straw scenario, because enemies create movement. So let my people go would never be enough, because they don't want to go. They want to stay. And so God sends the agitation, and I want you to reframe this week the role of an enemy in your life. Stop praying for God to remove that terrible boss at work, that awful neighbor, perhaps, or that person in your life or your family or your circle. Stop asking God to get rid of them, and maybe think this week, 10 months into this year, where you've been asking God to deliver you from these people, to deliver you from this emphasis in your life. The Bible says, resist the devil and he'll flee from you. So if despite your resisting, nothing's changing, the chances are it's not the devil. It's God who is not scared of you. Because you can't get delivered from God. If God's on your case, and this is what also you need to understand about God. God is willing to appear to be against you. God is willing to clothe himself in the form of Pharaoh. So the bricks without straw was God's idea, not Pharaoh's. It's God's idea through Pharaoh because God needs Pharaoh to make their lives more miserable to help them realize we're in trouble. Bricks without straw is God's way of letting you know that you've made friends with your bank robber, your Pharaoh. Bricks without straw is it's going to get worse before better, and you're going to get new trouble on top of your old trouble. And the new trouble is to let you know you can't keep staying here any longer. And only an enemy will create more drama for you, more trouble for you. So I want you to reframe the role of someone in your life that you keep praying, and it's getting to the end of the year, and you still feel that emphasis, that pressure that you're under, that stress-creating element. You're still wondering, when's God going to set you free from it? And the answer is he's not. He's using it to get you to move away from something, to get you to get some momentum in your life. He's trying to get you to separate from where you've parked up in your life. And God, the only way God can do that is through something uncomfortable. God is the God of your discomfort. And again, we have no theology for that because we have a come by our God often in the church. You all okay? A couple of minutes and I'm done. One more thing, okay? There's a difference between liberation and freedom. I think we use those words interchangeably, but they're two different things. Liberation is not freedom. Liberation is when the tanks, the Allied tanks go in to Iraq, and you see Saddam Hussein's bronze statue being pulled down and all the people dancing in the streets. We've seen that through history with liberation of countries and liberation of people from oppressive regimes and so on and so on. That's the day of liberation. It's not freedom. Freedom is what comes next, and it's much more complicated than liberation. Because we know, don't we? All of these people Moses liberated, they all died in freedom. That's how complicated this stuff is. What a tragedy that millions of them that were the first generation ever to march free died in freedom. They didn't die of slavery because they weren't slaves anymore. But they died of an attachment to Pharaoh that they retained. So they're free physically, but internally they're still married to Pharaoh. They couldn't let go of Egypt because they kept saying, wish we were back in Egypt. Wish we had the variation of diet that we had. Wish we had, the comfort of our daily routine. They wanted to reoffend, as it were, go back to Pharaoh. So they didn't die of slavery, they died of a slave mentality, which gave them this sense of victimhood and entitlement because they whinging to Moses that he should make their lives easier and better, not this manna anymore. And God got so angry with them for that. And so they all died in freedom. What a waste of time. And I want you to understand this because I think in Pentecostal charismatic type churches like yours and the one I built, I think we need to separate out and teach people the difference between liberation and freedom. Otherwise, what we have is this. We build churches where we park up on liberation and we call it freedom. It's not freedom because we're liberating the same people every week. I got tired as a leader thinking, why are you here again for hands laying on? When we laid hands on you so many times, you're going bald. And what happens is people get addicted to liberation who don't want to live free. And we shouldn't have that on offer in the church. We shouldn't have it in the shop window. But we do. And what we do is we promise liberation and we teach liberation and we use freedom and liberation interchangeably. And people come and feel liberated and feel so happy and testify and post about it. And they're an encounter and a touch and a blessing and a divine intervention. And a month later, nothing's changed. Because it's like the story Jesus told of the man with the demon cast out. He said, so if you don't replace that with a new idea, all those demons come back and bring company and move back in. So we don't want to build churches where you're addicted to liberation. Some of you are addicted to liberation and you have to go to liberation rehab. Because God's got better for you than just liberation. God wants you to live in freedom, and He wants you to keep your liberation and build on it for the rest of your life. And He wants you to move beyond liberation to freedom, and He wants you then to become a new delivery system for freedom and liberation to other people. But instead we have people that are stuck, get liberated, need liberating again and again and again, who never move beyond that. And then we form a relationship in the church where I am your Moses, as the pastor, I'm your Moses, you're my Israelites, and I liberate you every week. And it's a codependent, 12 steps Alcoholic Anonymous equivalent. It is. It's killing us all around the world. And it's killing pastors who are exhausted trying to keep all of you being set free. That is not my job. My hand on your head is no more powerful than your hand on your head. So don't be lining up for my hand on your head. We've got to stop all that. This man of God stuff. It's killing us. I'm teaching this all around the world. Trust me. I'm at ACC New South Wales this week. I'll be teaching it there. We've got an emerging generation are tired of it. And we've got to have a new idea. And I don't want to build churches where you think I have something you don't, because I do not. Where I have an inside track with God that you don't, I do not. I know something you don't, I do not. I have a power with God that you don't, I do not. And I don't want to build a life and a church based on a power encounter. I want to build a church based on empowerment of your life. And if I empower you, the chances are you're not going to need power encounters. You're going to need divine intervention. You're not going to need some supernatural intervention, because your education means that you need less of that. Because if we don't do that, I think we're on liberation, and that's all we keep doing. And we all keep circling the same liberation. And it's the same people year in, year out. And the church has got to have a new idea. And the new idea is, I'm going to teach you to fish. I'm not going to keep giving you a fish. And if I'll teach you to fish, the chances are you'll need less prayer, less counsel, and you become lower maintenance as a human and as a Christian. And now God can really start using you. Instead of you thinking it's all about you getting delivered and set free, which burns us out. Now I'm going to empower you to live free and stay free. If I can show you how to do that, I think that will be my greatest legacy to have amongst humans and amongst the church in the world. Father, thank you for these beautiful people that have come out, some of them for the second time today. I thank you. And all across the campuses that are tuning in, I pray that this will be a defining week for some of us, that this week we will have an awareness. We will figure out the thread of the narrative of our lives. We'll have sufficient self-awareness to interrupt our own internal story that is keeping us trapped inside the bank and stopping us living free. I pray for the courage to step away from our pharaohs, the courage to reframe a bricks without straw scenario in our lives. And instead of praying for you to fix it and stop it, to see that it has become your gift to us to create movement in our lives away from where we've got stuck. In Jesus' name, I ask you this for all of us tonight. Amen.